warm welcome here in Refo, Moabit. This is not a usual church. We are a community of 60 people that live here and work here. And we work at the intersection of community organizing and art, spirituality and justice. And therefore, this is one of the reasons why we also at the moment have this series on peace building. 1 week ago there was Daoud Nasser from Tent of Nations here as a guest, shared his situation there on his farm. And also in 2 days there will be the combatants of peace, Rotem, Levin and Osama Eligwat. If you want to come back, you can hear them here. But tonight, we're very happy and honored to welcome all of you panelists here and also to cooperate with ALMEP and Robert Bosch Stiftung, who initiated this unique and meaningful event. I think they will say more about the details, but for now I just want to welcome you warmly and wish you a very interesting and challenging and encouraging evening. So I'm handing over to Luisa Siemens from ALMEP and Irene Weins from Bosch Stiftung.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you again, Rike, and thanks for Refo Moabit for having us in this beautiful space. A very warm welcome from us. We're the organizing, organizations of this event tonight. My name is Luisa Siemens. I'm from the Alliance for Middle East Peace, or ALMEP. For those of you who are not familiar with the work that we're doing, ALMEP is the largest network of Israeli-Palestinian peacebuilding organizations in the region. So we have around 160 member organizations, and all of them bring together Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, both within the state of Israel as well as cross-border with Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza for meaningful encounters. And what we do as the Alliance for Middle East Peace, representing these organizations, is strengthening them and uniting them in the region, but also representing them internationally in front of governments and political stakeholders, and trying to really raise the awareness for this important work that is civil society peacebuilding, which are working every day, since decades, not just since the 7th of October, for a world of justice and equality for Israelis and Palestinians.
And it is my profound pleasure to welcome all of you here to tonight's panel on behalf of Robert Bosch Stiftung. Robert Bosch Stiftung is one of the biggest foundations in Germany, and we are active in the fields of health, education, and global issues. In all those areas and in the activities we organize, we work towards a fair and sustainable future. Our organization is rooted in the legacy of the entrepreneur and philanthropist Robert Bosch. My name is Irene Weins, and I'm part of the Team Peace at the Foundation. Within this topic, everything we do serves to promote locally led peace building and to amplify the voices of local peace builders. Since 2020, we support local peace actors in 3 regions, among them the Middle East. In addition, it is our goal to make the international system more conducive for locally led peace building. And we're so proud to have ALMEP as our partner, not only in this event tonight, but also in a bigger program working on trauma and peace building in Israel and Palestine. Both our organizations have learned in their work and during exchanges with local peace builders from Israel, Palestine, but also the wider Middle East region and beyond, that peace building on a local level cannot be done without addressing trauma and mental health issues. And while this seems so obvious and so easy to say, we have a lot of questions regarding the issue, especially in view of the situation in Palestine and Israel.
I think, or as we all know, the conflict in Israel-Palestine has always been a conflict where collective and intergenerational trauma has played a huge role. But obviously, since the 7th of October, you know, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, with almost 120 hostages still remaining in Gaza, dead or alive, nobody really knows, with almost 40,000 people killed in the war in Gaza, unprecedented levels of hunger, of displacement and violence. Obviously, the questions around trauma and pain are amongst those that we as a peacebuilding community, our NGOs on the ground, ask themselves every single day. And these questions, which we hope some of them we might, you know, come a little closer to an answer to tonight, resolve around, you know, the title of this event tonight. How do we carry on? How do we go on after the 7th of October? What can peacebuilding mean in a world post-October 7th, you know, facing all of this pain? Another question is, how do we deal with the very real pain and the very real trauma that we're seeing on the ground, with our community being very directly affected by this violence? And also, how can the work that our organizations do, that we sometimes call people-to-people peacebuilding, so very like direct human interactions, how can these programs avoid re-traumatizing people that might have gone through the absolute worst in the last 9 months?
I'm often asked what is meant by locally led peacebuilding, or people-to-people peacebuilding, or civil society peacebuilding, as Olmer would call it. We're convinced that local peace builders should be integrated in each and every step in conflict resolution. These local peace builders, who are often living in the middle of conflict each and every day, should have a central role when it comes to finding solutions. And no, this doesn't mean that other efforts on other levels are not necessary. For example, peace efforts or negotiations led by states or international organizations. But we need the locals to build peace in their communities, in their daily lives, before, during, and after those negotiations have taken place. So what role does locally led civil society peacebuilding play in Israel and Palestine? What can we possibly learn from other conflicts, other places, also when it comes to trauma awareness?
One thing that we also want to mention is that we're standing here as Germans. We're standing here in Berlin, in a place where not long ago the Germans committed a genocide against the Jews. And we know that trauma is an emotional response to a painful event in the past. And these events can, you know, create emotional biases across generations. And we are very aware that talking about Israel-Palestine is always emotional, and it's always complicated in Berlin, in Germany. And we want to mention that because it plays a role in this complex communication about trauma. It's not going to be the main focus tonight. We're not going to speak about Germany, but we're here and we're standing in a context. So we just wanted to mention that, and, you know, also invite you to think about that a little bit too, the emotional biases, to be aware of them, and to just keep them in mind.
So tonight, we want to put a spotlight on trauma and peacebuilding, but also on local expertise and local perspectives in peacebuilding. We would like to address some of the questions mentioned and hope to learn from our amazing panelists and to discuss and exchange with all of you. So help me or welcome together with me our amazing panelists. Please come to the stage now. Sanam, Ahmed, Jonathan, and John. John, who is AllNAP's Executive Director and who will facilitate our discussion tonight. Over to you, John.
Thank you so much, Irina. Thank you, Louisa. And thank you for an extraordinary introduction that I think set out the issues we want to explore, which I think are different to most starting points for conversations about Israel-Palestine. And I want to thank the Robert Bosch Stiftung for taking this approach, which is unique and unusual and very much needed in how we try and navigate what was already a very difficult issue before the horrors of the last 9 months. And I want to thank our hosts for allowing us to have this conversation in such an extraordinary venue as well. It's a privilege to be here with you all this evening. And thank you all for coming here on a really beautiful Berlin summer's evening. So thank you for making this a priority. As mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of ALMEP, John Linden. I'm pleased to be with you, but I'm particularly pleased to be introducing this fantastic panel that we have joining us here today. Really to think about this from different perspectives, but really leveraging peerless insights, academic, professional, personal, that I think can illuminate this conversation and this topic for us this evening. I want to introduce, first of all, Sanam Naragi Anderlini, who's an MBE, and she's the founder and CEO of the International Civil Society Action Network, or ICANN, with nearly 30 years of experience as a peace strategist. And Sanam also leads the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, promoting peace and preventing violence in 40 countries around the world. And particularly importantly, she was instrumental in drafting the landmark UN Resolution 1325, which is a groundbreaking milestone for the integration of women in peace and security and peace building, and is really a bit of a lodestar for us in the peace building field, and has changed the context for the better that many of us are working within. She's also served on the UN standby team of mediation experts and taught at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. And the MBE that I mentioned was awarded in 2020 by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth for services to international peace building and women's rights. Sanam is Iranian by birth, holding both British and American citizenship, and is now living and working here in Berlin, where she's a Robert von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy. Sanam, thank you for joining us this evening. I'm also delighted to introduce Dr. Ahmed Abu Akel, who has joined us today, flying in from Haifa, to share some particularly singular insights with us in this work. He's a cognitive and social neuroscientist and an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Haifa University. Ahmed is Palestinian. He's originally from the Wadi Ara region, and he's been involved in peace building since he was 15 years old, starting as a volunteer lecturer at Givat Aviva, which is this extraordinary institution, an early member of ALMEP, doing groundbreaking work on education amongst Palestinian and Jewish citizens of the State of Israel. Dr. Abu Akel is also known for his pioneering work on the mentalizing profiles of autism and schizophrenia, and for developing a neurobiological model of the theory of mind. His current research explores how autism and psychosis traits impact attention and social cognition, as well as the role of social cognition in intergroup conflicts, particularly important for the conversation we'll have this evening. He's authored several notable scientific papers, including research on the topic of how oxytocin increases empathy to pain in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he sits on the board of the organization Empathy for Peace, and as well as Bait of Hope, which I'm proud to sit on the board with Ahmed also. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming Ahmed this evening. Slower? Okay. As a dish, thank you, I'm sorry. I am Irish, and my accent is sometimes a problem in audiences who are so generous to be bilingual, where I am speaking my native language clearly enough. So apologies, and I will speak slower, thank you. Finally, we're joined by Yonatan Zeigen. Yonatan is an Israeli peace activist who has rededicated himself to peace and reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians after losing his mother, peace activist Vivian Silver, who was my friend and a friend to many people in the peace building community and an early architect of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, who was murdered on October 7th in Kibbutz Be'eri, and being heartbroken since about the war in Gaza, and really rededicating his every waking hour, as far as I can see, to trying to resolve this conflict. Yonatan is also a social worker and a trained mediator, again, very important for the conversation tonight. He was a peace activist during his early 20s and has now returned to what he's saying is enhanced political awareness. And he's most importantly a father of 3 children in Tel Aviv, and he grew up in Kibbutz Be'eri in the south of Israel, which, as many people know, was devastated on October 7th. So please also join me in welcoming Yonatan this evening. So I think Louisa and Irina really excellently laid out the questions we're looking to explore this evening. I'm not going to repeat them. What I'd like to kind of do is take these concepts and ideas, whether they're academic, social, personal, and now begin to root them in the specificity of what has happened in Israel-Palestine in recent months. And I'd like to turn to you first, Ahmed, if that's okay, to help us really define some terms. So leaning in, I think, both to your expertise in social and cognitive neuroscience, but also as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, living this conflict every day, to help us understand, in this context, what does trauma mean? Defining it for us to start the evening off, and then how it bleeds into any attempt to really try and resolve this conflict.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm honored to be in this venue and invited to talk about some complicated issue that we're all undergoing, not just in Israel-Palestine, but also the world over. I think it's easier for me to give a definition from a psychological perspective what trauma is and how we define it. I think trauma, as was concisely put, it's a reaction to a very strong experience that we've had, but what we are really doing is trying to self-preserve. So trauma is self-preservation. Now, our brain which is true, is basically governed by very strong biases that have been shaped over many, many, many decades. And the reason the brain does that, because it's trying to find the quickest and the most efficient way to actually survive. And in that attempt for survival, we are sometimes presented with choices that we trying to overcome the event that precipitated that trauma. One way we can think of it is we're trying to avoid that event. Another way is trying to mitigate it in some fashion, maybe perhaps by undermining the source of that trauma. But there is also another choice that we can actually, which is less convenient for us, create some sort of discomfort, and that we're trying to understand why that what caused the trauma and why it is affecting us in that way. How can we engage that source of trauma and to deal with it? Now, just as we are governed by these strong biases, the brain also has an important and fundamental way that it allows us to re-engage the world, to rewire itself, to basically try to undo those strong biases. And the question that we ask as social neuroscientists is how these biases are expressed in the brain, and the other thing, what can we do to actually undo them when we are faced with those such harsh choices? So I'm going to do a very quick experiment here. So the people on the right will now wearing red shirts. The people on the left now wearing blue shirts. Very quickly, what the red shirt people and the blue shirt people will start seeing each other as more similar. But also, you will start seeing yourself as more attractive, and you start seeing yourself as more intelligent. And it just demonstrates how quickly we can set into strong biases. But these biases can be undone. In a very elegant study that was done by the late Émile Bruno, he's a former colleague of mine who was also on the board of Empathy for Peace. Unfortunately, we lost him to brain cancer a few years ago. But he did what I think was a seminal study where he tried to show how hypocrisy, by pointing out hypocrisy, can help us undermine and deal with our biases. So in this particular experiment, they basically talked about incidents, terrorist attacks, that were perpetrated by a Christian. Another one was perpetrated by a Muslim. And what happens is that when you look at the Christian group, they would rate the blame, the Muslim community in general, or even the individual, 3 times more than they would have blamed the Christian member. But in a very elegant intervention, the moment we walked those participants into the thought process by which they actually understood how they actually blamed the other and trying to apply the set of values that they've had to the other group, we found that these people actually will be less likely to blame the entire Muslim community. So there was a reduction in their group bias. They also will be less likely to endorse policies that actually endorse Islamophobia or think that would bias against the other group. And even when we went back a year later, right, those things actually retained in their brain. So they were able to rewire their biases and to engage the public and understand that the set of values that they have, once they are applied to another group, that actually might help you to undo some of those biases. So I hope with these two examples, you need to understand that we're very quick to create biases, but at the same time, we are very good in able to undo these biases. I need to say, however, that undoing those biases are effortful. It's sometimes very difficult for the individual to arrive at that conclusion, and therefore we need a communal effort to be able to sustain that type of strategy to undo our biases. So I hope that will leave in your brain and your mind some of the strategies that you can actually undo when you are faced with those biases.
Thank you, Ahmed. That is an incredibly helpful way to kick things off and ground it in some academic structure to understand the concept better. Sanam, turning to you and actually asking you to draw both on personal experience in an individual sense, but also deep professional experience. And it's important to note, as a victim of the Iranian Revolution and its cascading consequences as a young person, and then also working with so many change makers around the world, each one of them individually and communally dealing with their trauma, how do you feel that ever-present sense of trauma relates to the field of trying to create social and political change?
Thank you. Thank you for the kind invitation as well and for being here. I've been in Berlin for 6 months. I leave on Saturday, so to end on this note is really a privilege and an honor. As you said, I mean, I deal with both people who have been traumatized by current wars, Sudan, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, and layers of trauma that they go through. At the same time as, you know, what propelled me into this work at the end of the day was I was 11 when I left Iran. It was meant to be 10 days vacation, and it's 45 years and counting. I've been back, but at the moment, if I go back, I don't know whether they would let me leave. And I don't know whether I can go visit my father's grave. So it's a very real issue, decade on decade in my existence. And then layered on a personal level, it's fascinating because sometimes I have to kind of step back and remind myself of what being Iranian actually means to me and the humanity that I know around me and the culture and the system that we have. Because I'm being bombarded with the messages of you're Iranian, therefore you're a terrorist, or you're a terrorist sympathizer. I've been accused of that, right? You support you're Iranian, therefore de facto you are anti-Semitic, and we sit there and say, but we have Iranian Jews who still have synagogues in Iran, and our community helped when the Holocaust was happening. So our narrative is completely hijacked, if you want, by the mainstream narrative. And that in itself is traumatic because it's scary to sit in an audience and sometimes say, yes, I am Iranian by birth and by heritage and so forth, because immediately it triggers people's. What I've seen in my, as I say, the experiences of people around me and the work it's if you want, 3 or 4 different things. So on a personal level, people seem to respond and cope differently. Some want to share and speak about it, some about what's happened to them. Some want to just pack it away in a room in their brain and never deal with it. You know, I know people who literally want to forget and have forgotten incidences that happened to them. Others, and this is where the Peacebuilders come in, and the women I work with, are often people who have taken their pain and their loss, and deep loss. You know, their children have been killed. And they've tried to give it meaning. Number one, that it wasn't a meaningless tragedy. But also the instinct to say, this happened to me, it's so painful, I don't want it to happen to another human being. And that I see driving, that was my story. I was like, my God, when your country implodes or there's conflict in your own country, it's such an awful experience. I don't want others to go through this. And then you enter the space of peace and war, and you realize, my God, weren't we lucky that we didn't have the Rwandan genocide or an actual active conflict? But that motive to say, you don't want to experience what I experienced, right? And then the other aspects of this, which I find interesting, is that when it's a collective, and everybody that you know is going through that same trauma, somehow the abnormal is the normal. It is what it is. When you step out, if you bring people from Gaza here to Berlin all of a sudden, and they see the football is going on and everyone's having a good time, it's a whole other way of being traumatized, because you suddenly realize that normal life goes on, and it's your situation. And then finally, the other aspect of this that I've kind of observed, and it's interesting, is that I think different cultures have a different way of dealing with trauma, actually at a cultural level. So, for example, in Iran, we have a duality. We have Shia Islam, which commemorates the martyrdom of the Prophet Hussein, who was in the sort of Islamic tradition, went to battle, and it was him in 72, and they were martyred. So we commemorate that every year, that sort of valiant victimization, if you want. But deep Iranian culture, which goes back to the Zoroastrians and back to sort of tradition, celebrating winter solstice and spring and so forth, is one that doesn't want to be acknowledging victimhood. Maybe it's an empire concept. We don't like to admit that. And so that means that we bury our trauma. When I talk to my friends who are all in their 50s now, none of us spoke about what happened when we were 11 years old and 15 years old and 20 years old. And it was, our parents didn't speak about what happened with the revolution. It was only much later that we're sort of look and say, hang on a second, were you, did they chuck you into an English boarding school as well? Or, were you off without your parents for 9 months, 10 months, 12 years? But we were never perceiving ourselves as victims because we didn't want, and I think different cultures kind of, on some level it might be healthy to acknowledge it. On other levels it might be really dangerous because you're picking at the scab constantly, right? So there's a difference, but it's important to just acknowledge, how do people deal individually, collectively as communities, and then the culture. And I'd be interested, from a Palestinian side and from the Israeli or the Jewish side, because we know the Jewish history. There's a lot of that, but it's maybe it's a resilience that we don't want to talk about things, but it's there, it's present. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sana. That's really helpful. I think both in the kind of general sense and then bringing it down as we begin to speak to Jonathan about the personal, the deeply personal as well. And Jonathan, obviously you have a background professionally in mediation and understanding sort of social issues and how the human mind works in a more abstract sense. And then of course your life was transformed tragically on October 7th in a very direct sense. And I work with people in the peacebuilding field every single day, but I would say since October 7th, the number of leaders such as yourself and several colleagues in Israel like Magen and Inon and Maoz Inon and many others has been this shift and change, and to Sanam's point, to create meaning perhaps in this utterly horrific and traumatic event. And I'd love, to the extent that you feel comfortable to discuss, how that trauma has framed the change in your life for the last 9 months, and an analysis, I suppose, of the self, of what led to it and what it has meant.
Thank you. I related deeply to Sanam saying about creating meaning, because for me, on October 7th, I was with my mother on the line, and I all through the morning until we parted, and the helplessness of saying goodbye to a loved one while they're being murdered live is overwhelming. And So what happened for me is this: I sat there in silence and overwhelmed by pain, and but pretty fast I started to process it, and what am I going to do with this pain? Am I going to let it overrun me, or anger overrun me? And for me it was, I need to heal. That was the first thing that came into mind, and also it became a collective call for healing. It's not only me that needs to heal, it's our communities and both our peoples that need to heal. And it was clear for me that in order to heal this pain, I can't fight it. I can't fight someone that caused the pain. I need to fight pain itself. I need to put an effort into eliminating the settings for pain. So it was a big sense of before and after in my life, because I was living a normal life, 3 kids, a job, and what I call a political coma. And I sat there and I said, life can't go back to soccer and normality. And it woke me up. It woke me up from this fantasy that there is normal life while the settings of pain persists, and that I need myself to be involved in it, like I saw my mother all those years. So that was the process that made me quit my job and start just to be invested in that, for my own healing and for both of our people's healing.
I think turning to the specificity, because there's general ideas of trauma that are very important academically or in politics and society, and then there's a deep specificity to Israel-Palestine that I think explains why you can get 100 people in halls around the world to speak about it in some way as well. And there's this Tolstoy quote that every happy family is alike, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own different ways. And if you look at Israel-Palestine, the specificity of the trauma of each population right now is important. And Luisa and Irina mentioned intergenerational trauma a little bit earlier. What's going on, not just since October 7th, but at a higher volume than ever before, is the recurring reliving of the worst traumas in the history of both the Palestinian and the Jewish people. And it's important to maybe set this context out. For Israeli Jews, the worst pogroms since the Holocaust and since the experience in Eastern Europe were visited upon a people who had assumed the state of Israel was designed to prevent this from happening. And an army that never came, never turned up, giving the sense of powerlessness that was inherent in the Jewish diaspora experience. And we've all seen footage, I think, of families cowering in terror that were redolent of the worst moments in Jewish history. And then for Palestinians everywhere, but most acutely in Gaza, the extraordinary loss of life that is now the worst loss of life in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since October 7th is in its own way a brand new and unprecedented trauma. But it also is redolent of the experience in 1948 in the Nakba, and particularly with the displacement which has accompanied it, where 80% of the residents in the Gaza Strip are displaced internally, and 70% of Gazans are themselves refugees and their descendants already. So this isn't an abstract reliving of that trauma. And then for Palestinian citizens of Israel, this piece isn't really spoken about very often, but we see it amongst our members a lot. There is a sense of chilling, kind of McCarthyite atmosphere about what you can say around the conflict. And though you're supposed to be a fully enfranchised citizen of the state, during this moment of crisis and conflict, it's difficult for Palestinians to talk about what's taking place, Palestinian citizens of Israel. And that sort of constrained citizenship and rights is very reminiscent of the period of military rule that Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel lived under from 1948 until 1966. Each one of those things are the things that grandparents or parents either speak about or don't speak about to their children, but everybody understands it's in the deep history of each identity. And they're all being relived at once together, with those traumas interacting and relating to each other. So I think thinking of that deep specificity, but also understanding that every conflict everywhere in the world has been ended by traumatized people, as a rule. There's no conflicts without traumatized people. So everyone who has been an agent in conflict resolution has either harnessed or overcome or dealt with in some way with that level of trauma. And Sanam, turning to you again, I would love to hear your analysis of that specificity in Israel-Palestine and what it may mean, and your expertise of seeing how trauma impacted and affected efforts at conflict resolution, particularly grassroots ones where it's citizens, ordinary communities, taking that role on to be agents for conflict resolution despite, because, or with the trauma at work.
Thank you, and I definitely defer to my friends here to talk more about the specificities. But I think it's on so many different levels because, as you said, you have different narratives, first of all, right? You have the Jewish narrative, the Israeli narrative. The Nakba probably doesn't exist, or it's framed in its own way. You have the Palestinian narrative, and the Nakba being an important thing, obviously. You have, when you try to make peace, you have to have some level of feeling equal. And one of the issues that when I started with this work in the 1990s, there were Israeli and Palestinian women working together. There was a lot of interaction between civil society on both sides. But one of the frustrations was always that, from the Palestinian side, was that this is an occupation. We are not equal. What happens to us as Palestinians and the limitations that we face, the Israelis don't have, right? So this equalizing of trying to sort of bring it out, and the international community say, oh, both sides. This is, it doesn't matter what I think, it doesn't matter what you think. The point is the perception of the people living it, right? And how are they being heard? Because if we don't hear what they're saying and we don't understand their experience, and we just keep telling them, you're going to have a two-state solution, or you're equal, it just pulls people apart. So that's one thing that I think is important, that how does each side perceive itself? How are they hearing the trauma of the other side, if you want, and the history? And can we come up with a shared narrative of what happened? Where are we now? And for me, from the standpoint of the work that I've seen in mediation and peacebuilding, and I'm jumping a little bit, but one of the things that I find troubling is that on the one hand, we need to have that narrative, and we need to sort of understand where everybody's coming from, right, to be where they are. On the other hand, we get stuck in that past, right? Where do you start the story? And whose story? Do you go back to the Torah and the Bible, or do you start in 48, or do you, and all of that in some ways, actually, is kind of irrelevant, because we should be starting about where are we going now? What's the future we can create, right? And if you look at what the South Africans did, was they, from the 1950s, they started talking about a people's charter. And it was a vision of the South Africa that they wanted, right? And everybody got to give their input into this people's charter. So each generation that came could look at the situation and look at that charter and say, yes, I sign up to that vision. That's the direction I want to go in. And their leadership at some point came along, and not only Mandela and Tutu and others had the presence of mind and the heart to be able to say, I forgive and we need to go forward, but from the apartheid regime side, also they had a counterpart who was willing to say, the way things are working right now is taking us to disaster. Zimbabwe next door is in civil war. We don't want that. We love our country. We've got to do things differently. And politically they sat and they said, what's the future we want? And the future we don't want? What does that mean in terms of what we have to do in the present? And if we're here and we want to go there, how are we going to deal with the traumas of the past? The injustices, the criminality, the deaths, etc., etc. So the future was guiding the present, dealing with the past. We don't have that happening in any peace process anywhere. That just doesn't, the mediation folks don't do that. If we're lucky, they're taking step by step. Like look, and imagine that you have to look up and say, I'm going there, and then you have to be watching your steps going forward. But if you're only looking down, you can be going around in circles, right? So, and if you only look over there, you can stumble on the steps. So it's that balancing act that is really, really important. And two factors, I think, come into it, and again, the work that I've seen. One is, as I said, the political will. You need the political leadership to wake up and say, we've got to do things differently. And then you need inclusivity. You need a public and you need a civil society that is driving it. And you can have, it can go both ways. You can have civil society driving it to foster that political will. Or you can have political will that then gets the civil society. But you can't have them separate. And we've had that, again, in Israel, Palestine, in Colombia. We've had such stories where they've come together and then they've gone separate, and they've come together and they've gone separate. So those are sort of some of the big picture things. On a human level, on a personal level, one of the things that when we were starting our network, I had been talking to Israeli and Palestinian colleagues about their efforts. And one of the things that they said to me was that, they'd been working together, and then the second intifada in the early 2000s came, and there was violence, bus bombs, and then incursions by the military, by Israeli military into West Bank and so forth. And one of the things that they said was that when the violence happened, our friends and colleagues on the other side didn't call to say, hey, how are you? Are you okay? Is your family okay? Palestinians said this, and the Israelis said this, right? So for me, the lesson there was that we need to care for the personal emotions and the friendships and the relationships that we have. Because when you've come this forward and you're trying to foster a middle ground, and you're the bridge, if you want, and your own community is saying, why are you talking to those people? Yeah. Right? And you're in the middle, and you only have each other to hang on to. And then something happens and you're being pulled back into your side. You want your friends to call out and say, hey, are you okay? And that, when that doesn't happen, it's a deep personal, it's like heartbreak, because you're like, what happened? They didn't care about me, right? So I think that as peace builders, this is another thing that while we think about strategy and what we do in collective action and so forth, understanding each other's pain and being able to just acknowledge it, to say, as a human being, I see what's happening to you, and take the politics out of it and just see that. I think that's very important as well.
That's hugely helpful, Sanam, and it's actually it's a segue, Ahmed, to conversations I remember having with you very immediately after October 7th, and asking for tools and techniques and interventions that we could bring to the peace building field to deal with that almost competitive trauma, or that making sure that we had that sense of in-group solidarity. And I was asking all this of you, as my friend Ahmed, who is one of the most foremost experts in the world on this, but I was also asking a Palestinian who is living this in real time from my privilege in Europe to help me with these tools and techniques. And I'd love to hear from you, as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, how what we were speaking about, that subjectivity of trauma, relates to your experience.
Well, as a Palestinian, is a very complex identity because then we have, I mean, the way I look at it from a spatial perspective, you have Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, who, even if they chose to call themselves Israeli, they cannot be called Israelis because Israeli is not a nationality. It's not something that you can even use as a common denominator in the very country you live in. Nationalities are typically defined geopolitically. You're Germans because you live in a place you call Germany. Then there are Palestinians who live in the West Bank. They have different dynamics than the one that we have as Palestinians within Israel. And then you have Palestinians who live in Gaza. And then you have Palestinians who live in the diaspora. And they can be divided into different groups and identities. People who live in refugee camps, like in Syria and Lebanon, who don't even have a nationality in the very countries that they live in. And then people who are scattered throughout the world, right? So in order for us to understand Palestinians and how they deal with the trauma, we have to actually appreciate the very dynamics that they go through in the very setting that they are in. And I really like what Jonathan said, that but with maybe one shared denominator to all of these Palestinians is to actually change the setting. How can I change the setting? So one thing I always try to look for is a point of entry. So one thing that I know backfire is the moment that people try very quickly to make comparisons between the Nakba and the Holocaust. Now, we need to understand that these two events exist in their own right. And what we should be aware of is that to avoid that race for victimhood, like your competitive victimhood, like my trauma is much more severe than yours. And I'm not sure even to say that I really understand what you're going through is actually an effective strategy. What we need in this particular case, particularly if you are in a position of power like the State of Israel, because the way the Palestinians view the dynamics with the State of Israel, as Israel is the occupier and the Palestinians are the occupied, is that the people in power need to learn how to listen actively to our narrative. And will benefit, and that's how they will benefit. They will benefit from reading our stories. They will benefit from listening to what we have to say. And the people who are occupied, they actually will benefit more if they know they are being listened to, right? I think that's one strategy that I think might be very influential in how we can change the dynamics, at least to create a platform by which we can engage in dialogue. Another one that I think it's really important is sometimes it's beneficial for us to create what I call a third polarity. If Palestine is one pole and Israel Jewish people are another pole, we need to create a sphere where we actually create some shared values that we agree upon. And sometimes people resort to the very basic ones, such as food and music. In one of the events of the wars, unfortunately, there was a restaurant owner who said, I'll give you a 50% discount if you agree for a Palestinian and a Jewish person to sit down on the same table and have a meal together. The degree of segregation that we have within Israel is immense. So very few people may have even entered my village, Arara, which is in the state of Israel. And it's ironic that my niece, who went to Seed for Peace, for the first time that she actually actively engaged a Jewish girl was in the United States, not in her town, which is just only a few miles away. So we need to take that into consideration. Another thing is that in the context of this conflict, we need the help of the world community. It's very easy for you to take one side because it might satisfy your worldview and your perspective, and you see shared similarities. But you need to ask yourself, is this indeed the most beneficial route by which we actually change the world to a better place? And we need to have a neutral entity. Now, who is the neutral entity in this dynamics between Palestinians and the Jewish people in general and Israel in particular? Is it the United States? Is it Germany? Is it the UK, or is it some other entity? And we know, like again, I'm putting back on my scientist hat, we know the best strategy is to find a person we know they have no interest whatsoever in the other party. We need a complete neutral person that perhaps might be the most beneficial mediator. And to pick on the point that Sanam said, in terms of the peace process, I mean, peace process is a very complex word. I don't think people understand it. You either have peace or you don't. But if we want to think about the steps that we need to take in order for us to achieve peace, the diplomatic route is a very complicated one, because the people who are there are not there long enough for them to be able to engage the other party in a very meaningful way. It's ironic, actually, this morning I watched Ayalon, who was the head of Shin Bet, which is security, and he basically, the person who created the charter for how the Shin Bet need to engage with the Palestinians. Only now he understands, after he left his position, it's not when he was in a position of power, he's able to come on the screen and say, well, I think the idea of trying to suppress, undermine, and have this militarily route as the most effective one is not going to be effective. So sometimes we need this kind of revelation that comes through the diplomatic process, but in order for it to be effective, it needs to be long-term, and the partners and the members of the people of that diplomatic process need to be engaged in it for a very long time.
Excellent. Thank you, Ahmed. Jonathan, thank you. Turning to you, I've personally witnessed you having quite a lot of impact in conversations with Israelis and some Palestinians, you know, because with the trauma that we're speaking about, with a sort of an empathy and a sensitivity, but also kind of a steely determination and a sort of this idea of where we're going to get to in the future. And as Sanam was saying, that's the thing we can talk about, the traumas in the present and the past, right? But the future's not yet written. But obviously that's an incredibly difficult context to navigate with people. I mean, we're talking about trauma. It's important to note this isn't post-trauma. The trauma is recurring every single day. This period hasn't ended. So it's, I imagine it's like tiptoeing on ice very often with many of the conversations. And as you said, you're doing it every day now. Do you have any insights or tips or advice for those of us who are also trying to gently persuade Israelis and Palestinians, or Ahmed's point, internationals, to be productive actors towards something more just and peaceful?
Well, it seems like it's two different questions. That one is what I do, and one is what I advise others. So it's difficult for me to answer the second one, because sadly I was granted this kind of moral authority only because of my status, bereaved status. And it's different for other people, and so I can't really tell others how to act or what to do outside of do your best. But personally, what I find helpful for me, and I wish I could take credit for it being an effort, but it's just the way my mind works, is firstly, I have the sense of differentiation between feeling and intellect. Because I know that the internal world of everybody is like a spectrum. It has a lot of ugly things and a lot of beautiful things. But when we differentiate between what we feel and we accept it, we acknowledge our feelings, but then we go out into the world with our minds, not only our internal turmoil. So that helps me. A second thing is something I actually studied at social work, is externalization of the issue, externalization of the problem. I'm not facing a problem where someone killed my mother. We are all facing a problem of violence. So I see it an example with my own kids. You know, sometimes when my kids throw tantrums, and sometimes I want to suffocate them. I want to fight them back. But sometimes when I breathe deeply and I say, let's try together fight the anger demon that is trying to take over our family now. So I externalize the problem, and then I can work together with this. In this instance, it's two peoples, two sides working together to eliminate the external problem, which is war and violence and oppression and trauma. A third thing which is connected is transcending the personal. In my mind, war and atrocities are not personal. It's something that it's not something that was done to me. We are all victims, Palestinians, Jews, soldiers, freedom fighters or gunmen from whatever you call them. We are all victims of our circumstances. So the man who killed my mother is not a man. He is a weapon of war. And my mother is not Vivian Silver in that instance. She is a victim of war. And in doing that, or in this mental process, I am able to transcend the personal aspect of pain and try to work with it and eliminate it. And the fourth thing that I found helpful for me is, and Sanam and Ahmed talked about it, is acknowledging and accepting. When I talk to Israelis or Palestinians, and it can become a heated argument or something like that, I find myself totally accepting without criticism what they are experiencing and what they are saying, and then expressing what I feel and what I say and what I think should be the actions we should all take in the world. So it's not, it becomes not a clash or a race to the bottom. It becomes, okay, I can hug you because I acknowledge what you are feeling. I see it with my own community in Be'eri, which a lot of them are now experiencing or expressing what I call trauma talk. A lot of anger. And I don't feel that way, but when I talk to them, I don't argue with them. I accept it, I nod, I relate, and then I say and act the way I think is right.
Have you found that reciprocated then? Because you take that approach, does it often generate the same dynamic from that other traumatized person?
Yes, I found the discussions to be a lot more effective and a lot more compassionate.
Excellent. That, you might not have meant it, that is advice for all of us on how we have these conversations, I think, as well. So thank you for answering the second part too. Just before we open this up to a conversation with everybody, I want to root it for one quick round again, back to the work we're doing in the region. So I think, as mentioned in the introduction, with 160 members of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, Louisa and I are going to Israel and Palestine on Sunday to meet with our members on both sides of the Green Line, and to try and have versions of this conversation with them to understand their plans, their techniques, their ideas, their strategies for how they can, with everything understood and how difficult the situation is, nonetheless redouble their efforts towards resolving this conflict and giving everybody peace, equality, security, justice, as difficult as that might be. And I would love to hear from the panel about that almost as a strategy, understanding it's a tall mountain to climb, but that there is no other alternative. what you would advise or observe or perhaps critique about different ways in which we as a collective can embark on that project. And I'd love you to start, Ahmed, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, as I said, we're all really influenced by very strong biases. Like the moment you engage a person that you identify as an out-group member, like if I'm engaging a Jewish person, and I have all these memories that have been passed on to me through my parents and family and communities, then there's a strong defensive mechanism that I have in my head. And the one thing that I do is, it's not that I'm trying to actually run away from that. I'm trying to question, why do I have this bias? Like, why do I have this anger, for example? Why do I have this fear sometimes? Because they're in a position of authority. And then acting on those biases and confronting them, I think I have much better chance of trying to develop strategies to be able to engage the other person. Of course, listening actively is something very important. But then the moment that I see resistance from the other person, I try to take him to a third polarity. And one of the techniques that I have is I speak in English. I speak Hebrew. Sometimes I find it that because language sometimes that you speak in naturally brings in like very strong biases and emotional content to them. The moment you speak in English, then I help them basically not to see me in a particular bin or category. And then they are starting seeing this individual as Ahmed. The name no longer brings up these memories because somehow I am speaking this other language that they were not expecting. And I try to create basically context where basically strip them from their own biases as well as my own biases. And because the first thing that I would like to do, can I engage in a conversation with that person? Because the other strategy to avoid these biases, to retreat, to suppress them, to go away, not to engage that person, that will lead us to a no solution. So the idea is to actually face this discomfort that you have with your own biases. So if you have certain biases about a person being from another group, then you have to ask the question, why I have this bias? If you're able to do that, pull on that as hard as you can, because that bias will undo maybe other biases that you have. It's kind of stitched biases that you have in your brain, and then just pull one very hard, maybe will undo all these other biases. The other thing that I think about is that we as collective individuals, we are very reluctant to get out of our comfort zone. What I mean, we somehow accept the current reality where there's this extremist end that are taking us to a particular end or vision that they've had, but their value system is 0 and 1, either messianic or jihadist, for example. The people in the middle, they may actually go along with them because we accepted the narrative saying, oh, we are there to protect you. But what are they really protecting? Our convenience to go get a latte, or just to go to work in the morning, or to take our kids to school? These are the kind of conveniences that we are basically accepting, allow us to accept the extremists to have their way for a long time. So I think there's some collective effort that we need to make, that we need to get out of those conveniences and trying to stave off what we know for sure is going to be a very abysmal end. So the alternative, the question I always have, what's the alternative to the current world reality? Is it having a long-lasting victory, or is it a long-lasting peace? And the choices among us is to basically work out which one we want. And so that's some of the things that I do in order to deal with those issues.
Thank you, Ahmed. And Sanam, I think of everybody on the stage today, you have the most expertise in seeing different configurations of civil society in conflict with varying levels of success or effectiveness. I'd love if you could share some insights and genuine practical advice for what you would urge sincere Israeli and Palestinian peace builders to embark on following this devastating war.
Sure, thank you. I think before we talk about that, two things are really important around the question of trauma. One is that so long as the violence continues, we're adding to trauma every day. More and more people are getting killed, more and more families. So the imperative of a ceasefire and dealing with the hostages, that is such an important imperative. Every day makes a difference, right? That's one thing. The second thing, which is totally unprecedented, and this started in 2012 with the Syrian conflict, but right now it's even more exacerbated, it's that we have on our phones daily genocidal violence, daily images that are horrific, and everybody's seeing the images that comes from their community, right? And the problem is that if we think about historically, when the Rwandan genocide happened, I was working as a journalist, I was an intern in CNN, and I saw it on the screen, and I was like, how is it possible to watch this horror in front of our eyes and do nothing about it? But it was a news item, and then it would disappear, right? When you have social media and it's in your phone, it's not disappearing. People are seeing it, and we're not allowing any emotional scar tissue. It is digging at it every day, and that's a whole new thing that psychologists and neuroscientists need to really be looking at. So I think we need to acknowledge that, but the stopping of the violence is really critical. Now, in terms of what to do around peace processes, so again, Israel-Palestine has been the place where they have tried pretty much everything at any given moment in the last certainly 20, 30 years at least, of civil society, of people processes and so forth. But I think that we are, to me, I think what's important now is first of all to enable two parallel dialogues and people's peace processes. So Palestinians, if I were designing this, I would say Palestinians get, teachers, doctors, journalists, women's organizations, youth organizations, victims, the people who've lost relatives, sit together with the political actors, with the armed actors, because they have to. But as Palestinians decide, what do we want? Where do we need to go? What don't we want? And similarly, a similar conversation on the Israeli side. It is, if we leave it to the international community, what's going to happen, when it's already happening, is that you're going to have international NGOs running in and saying, oh yes, we can bring Israelis and Palestinians together for them to talk. I mean, imagine in the middle of a genocide, you're asking people to come in, or whatever we want to call it, to come in. It's dangerous. It can be harmful. So we have to be very careful about the ones who are able to talk to each other. What's the safe space we're giving them? And who is doing that and doing it in a trusted way? And that's where your work is so important, because many of us were waiting to see who's going to come out first and speak about the letter, for example, that you wrote to the G7, right? It needed to come from the community. But that safe space for those who are able to. Otherwise, it's working in parallel to talk about where are we going, what do we want, what don't we want, and really the voice of the people is really important, because the politicians have gotten us to the place we are right now. The politicians failed, and the international community has a tendency to come in and say, we need a political solution. No, it's not just a political, we need a societal solution to this. And to the extent that the groundwork can be laid for saying, identify your representatives, let's make sure that it's fully inclusive of everybody and how people can organize themselves to have representatives to come, and what should the conversation be, and using creative things like graphic illustrations to draw out where are we, where do we want to go, what don't we want, these kinds of things. The other aspect of this, which I find always, in my work I've always found it interesting, is that instead of talking big language issues, do you want this government, do you want two-state or not, or whatever that is, right? It's to bring it down and say, what do you want daily life to look like for your children, for your grandchildren? Draw it out. They go to school, they come back, they want to play football, they want to, whatever it is, both because it's really important to humanize and show what peace looks like and what peace is, because we take peace for granted. Right? We all take peace for granted. Mm-hmm. It's only when it's gone that we realize what we had. But to bring it back, and then if it's done with illustrations and so forth, it's almost to be able to say, well, if you take the Palestinian and show the Israelis what they're saying, and if you take the Israeli version and you bring it to the Palestinian, and if you take what they're afraid of, and to begin a kind of almost like a shuttle diplomacy, if you want, between the two sides, but people to people, and engaging people in the big political conversations in a very serious way, right? Because I think that what happened in the 1990s was that there were people-to-people dialogues, but they didn't get the doctors to talk about what are we going to do about right of return, or what are we going to do about the state of Jerusalem, and that was left to the politicians. Right?
Yes.
Ordinary people, we all, once we're informed, or we are often informed, have views. Let them be part of the solution, and challenge the question of, if you were in charge, what would you do, right? What can we do? What can we have to, the future hasn't been written, and these incidences have to have some meaning for others as we go forward.
Thank you, Sana. Jonathan, just briefly before we open up the conversation to the wider audience, we have a model for how Israelis dealt with trauma in the second Intifada, and you know the sort of experience of it was that there was a swing away from support for peace potentially. I don't know if you disagree with that analysis. We have obviously far greater levels of trauma now, and in those parallel conversations that Sanam talked about, you are going to be at the core of many of those discussions with a fellow community of peace builders in Israel, and I would love your observations, I guess, on that as a project, on how we can actually bring the Israeli population and the Palestinian population separately to deal with this trauma in a way that begins to look at resolving the underlying issues rather than repeating these cycles again.
I think what Sanam said was beautiful, and I'm willing to sign on that. But I wish I had your optimism for our capacity to do that. I'm not so sure. Because as you said, you know, it's not like a sterile thing you do at a lab. There is ongoing occupation. Now there is a brutal war going on. And in general, it was a prolonged war for 100 years. So all the biases, all the trauma, all the violence is continuing, and then to stop and to have these effective conversations, I think is very hard. But that's not to say that we don't have to do it. We do, because I see it as a dialectical clash. There are powers in both peoples who are in coalition, right? There's a power of annihilation and death, and the power of peace-seeking and life. And these two powers exist in both peoples, and they are in coalition. And there's like a pulling. Where is the new status quo going to land? Because now there is movement. In this kind of catastrophe, it creates movement. And both sides are pulling to their direction. And we need to pull very hard. We need to do the work on the ground, which we are doing. I mean, civil society, it might be surprising or not, but civil society in Israel and Palestine is very strong. But the obstacle is that there's a glass ceiling if the political sphere isn't involved and doesn't have any vision or any horizon. So in that sense, I get pretty discouraged in hitting this glass ceiling. And I think that we should pressure and legitimize the political sphere internally, but mostly externally, from the international community, to form a bloc for peace from the international community, to then pressure us and legitimize our voices on the ground. We need this. It's like Tnuat Melkachayim in Hebrew. Yeah, like yeah. So I put a lot of effort. That's why I'm in Germany, or I came from the United States just now, in trying to advocate for the international community to it's like a cycle. I want to pressure them to pressure me. Yeah.
I think now it would be wonderful to hear from all of you. So there are 2 roving mics that are going to be passed around. If people could just raise their hand that they'd like to speak. And just a quick ground rule. I think we've had a very thoughtful, empathetic conversation here on a very sensitive subject. It'd be wonderful if we were able to continue that tone. And obviously we need to get into difficult issues, but try and remain respectful, I think, of the speakers and the sensitivities and the trauma of what we've been discussing.